Hi, I'm Maddie Armstrong. I'm a Skype scientist intern, and I am happy to introduce Rick. He is going to be running our live stream today, and they are finishing up their 5th year in their neuroscience PhD at Yale. And we're going to be talking about research with milkshakes and lasers and learning. So it's going to be really exciting. And definitely visit our website to check out the rest of our live stream talks for July. And I'll kind of touch on that closer to the end. But yeah, this is Rick. How are you doing?
Doing well. Awesome. I'm super excited to be here. I love talking about lasers, milkshakes, and learning. So that's what I do for a living currently. And yeah, so ready to get it off the ground. It's cool.
Awesome. Yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit why are you interested in science? Like what kind of got you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from North Florida originally, so a small town close to Jacksonville. It's called Palaca, Florida. And so I grew up there, and I was not really interested in science in school myself. I found it really boring actually to memorize stuff out of textbooks like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And so, which is interesting because it was in contrast to what I liked in my personal life, because I really liked science fiction movies and games, and I really was interested and curious in the natural world. But as I'll mention earlier, I ended up going through college and found out that research was a thing, and so I was really blown away by the chance to dig deep in questions that no one really knows the answers to in science and try to figure those out. So I was really fascinated by that, and I went to the University of South Florida in Tampa, and I majored in cell and molecular biology.
That's awesome. Yeah, so like a childhood curiosity. Just
Yeah, definitely curiosity was, I think, the biggest driver, because I wasn't necessarily, I mean, I liked science was probably my favorite subject, but I wasn't super interested in it at that point because my school system was not super great. And so we were mostly just doing stuff out of the books. We weren't doing like experiments and things like that.
that's awesome. Yeah, so do you want to tell us more of like what you do now? Because I'm really interested. I'm not sure. I know there's learning, but
Right, absolutely. So yeah, I would be happy to. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. So because I think it might be a little bit easier if we look at some graphic aids. And I think whenever people talk about their research, one of the best things to do oftentimes is to ask yourself why, right? The so what question I think is really important. And for learning and memory, it might be obvious to a lot of people why we should study it. So you may know, or many of you may have family members or know someone who is affected by something like Alzheimer's disease. But if you don't, it's a disorder that affects the way that people learn and retain and recall memories. And so this is really troubling because it usually happens to older folks, and so they forget to like who their family is or who their kids are and things like that. And so this is on one side of memory and learning that is really interesting because it's the loss of memory. But if we look at the flip side of memory disorders and learning disorders, there's something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So this could be memories that are too strong, and they will cause anxiety or depressive feelings or something like that in people if they have a really traumatic or bad experience. And so I bring both of these up because these are sort of the two ends of a spectrum of what memory and learning can what sort of encapsulates them. And then, but the brain is still learning about things in the same way in both of these cases, or for instance, not being able to recall them in the same way. And so I'm interested in studying what's going on inside the brain that makes this possible. So what is it that really, like in a normal situation, how do people learn? And if we understand that better, we can try to help develop treatments or drugs that can help people that are suffering in both of these cases and also anywhere in between. So that's why I'm doing it, as far as how it relates to public health and how it can benefit people. But I'm also just really fascinated, as we mentioned earlier, and curious about how this happens, because it's really interesting to think about that everything that makes you a person, everything that you think or feel or whatever you will do or plan to do, happens because of what's going on in your brain, right? There are these connections between brain cells, and the ability to learn about your environment and store those experiences as memories is really critical for you to be able to survive. And the way that I'm trying to understand how this works in the brain is I basically if we zoom into the brain for just a second and imagine this cartoon brain cell. So this is where a brain cell basically mostly lives, and then it's sending its arm out. And the whole basis of the way your brain works is because you have brain cells that communicate with each other. And so they're always talking to each other. And I'm able to specifically turn on certain brain cells by shining a laser at them. And so brain cells don't normally do this, right? If I put a laser in your brain, for instance, right now, it would probably not be super great. And it also wouldn't be very useful because I couldn't turn on any brain cells for you. But there's this really cool technique called optogenetics, or opto for light and genetics for genetic engineering, that allows us to target specific brain cells so we can turn them on. And so I'll show a quick video to where you can see what that looks like. And so this is, again, one of those brain cells, just in a much better version than I can draw. And so these little green dots are the genetically engineered proteins we're able to put on those brain cells. And so now what's cool about them is these are, they open up basically and are able to sort of short circuit what the brain cell is doing and turn it on just when you shine a laser at it. And so now we're going to be zooming out and you see all the brain cells, the other ones in the background, right? And then now the green ones here, shown here, are just the ones that we've genetically engineered. And then if you were to shine a laser at the entire brain, you can turn on just those brain cells, like you'll see just right about now. So all of those turn on, even while the brain is doing its other stuff too. And this is really powerful because you can do this in awake behaving mice. And now,
A quick question, since I don't know too much about like brain anatomy. So the brain's mostly just made up of cells, like neurons, right?
right. We really focus a lot on neurons as the brain cells, but there's actually a lot of different cells inside the brain that help support the neurons too. But yeah, whenever we're studying the brain, we're mostly focusing on the neurons, although we should be looking a little broader.
Gotcha. Okay, so lots of different types of cells kind of keeping the brain together, but what you're focusing on is these neurons, since you're kind of using the lasers to like highlight different cells.
Right. So the optogenetics actually comes in two parts. So the highlighting in the green part is sort of like an added benefit. It makes those cells glow green, and so we could do that without the optogenetics. But the optogenetics is sort of an additional thing that allows us to control them. Because after we do all this controlling of the brain cells, we need to go back in and look at the brain and make sure that we actually targeted the right brain cells. So this is a really great point that I didn't fully clarify, but so we were able to light them up green and also control them. And those two things are separate, but they're really, we have to have them both in order to make sure we know what we're actually doing. So great point. Yeah, so we're able to target specific cells and turn those green, but I won't go into the genetics behind it, but we're able to use some cool techniques to do that. And I mentioned that we're able to do this in awake behaving mice. And so now I'm going to show you what it looks like in a mouse. So I'm able to target specific brain cells in this mouse. And this is a behavioral box. So it's just a little chamber that I put the mouse in for 30 minutes a day. And I have to train this mouse that whenever it hears a sound, it needs to go put its nose in this hole. And that's what a nose poke is called. And if it does that, it's going to get a milkshake. And as you may have guessed from my talk, mice really love milkshakes. They actually like it a lot more than cheese. And so they're going to work for it. And they only have 30 minutes a day, so they have to try to figure this out really well. But the tricky thing about training mice, as you may have seen for training your dogs or cats, is that you actually can't tell them you want them to do this, right? I can't say, hey, mouse, I need you to put your nose in this hole when the sound comes on. But they have to learn by trial and error. So it takes them some time to do that. And with the laser comes into play, they get it right. Am I breaking up a little bit? It looks like my internet is unstable.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was mine.
Okay.
It sounds like there's a little bit of difficult internet, so everyone stick with us just in case anything gets a little complicated.
Cool. Well, if it messes up, I can hardline into my router.
Yeah, we were getting some questions about how do lasers and milkshakes kind of come together, and I think we're about to find out. So.
Right, exactly. So just to recap that part of it, so all mice in this task are going to be learning to get milkshakes, right? But the question is, can the mice that are getting the laser, the one on certain brain cells, can they learn faster and be better at this task than other mice? And that will teach us about which brain cells are important for learning and memory, right? And because the mouse here is getting laser at this time and will retrieve a reward, and so does that group of mice learn better than normal mice? And we can look at that in some of the data that I'll show here. So I'll explain the way this graph works first, and then we can see if people have some ideas on what they think would happen. So on the y-axis of this graph I'm showing the number of milkshakes that each mouse gets. On the x-axis is the training day. So as I mentioned, they can only go in the box for 30 minutes a day, and I have to train them multiple times. And the gray line here are the normal mice, so the ones that are not getting laser. And so this is the average of 6 mice in each group. And so you can see that they're doing pretty well. They get about 10 rewards early on. And when they cross this green dotted line around day 8 or 9, that means that they've learned the task because they're getting about a milkshake a minute, which is pretty good for mice. And so now what I want to do is I want to see if I plot the data for the laser mice, do they learn faster or slower? So maybe we can just open this up to everybody and see what they think. So if the mice were able to learn faster, how do we think the line would look? The line would sort of be on top of the gray line and be very similar? Would it be under it, or would it be over it? Or how many days, for instance, a better way to, how many
Oh, it looks like,
days do you think it would take the laser mice, if they're learning faster, to get 30 million?
yeah, so if anyone has any guesses, type them into the chat. Do you think that the line will be above or maybe below or different? What do you kind of guess? What's your hypothesis, I guess? Okay, we have
Exactly.
someone voting for above. Oh, we have a vote for below. Okay. Getting some mixed feedback.
Nice.
And then someone said we might have a much steeper learning curve above.
Nice. So that's a really good way to put it. So people may have learned about a steeper learning curve. Yeah. Cool. All right. So it looks like we got a good mix of answers, and I like the interest in taking, maybe some chances and going against the grain, because that's what really fuels a lot of great science. And what we see if we look at the laser mice is that the blue line is actually above. And so while it took about 9 days for the normal mice to learn, it took only about 5 days for the laser mice to learn and to get 30 milkshakes a day. And so this means that they learned almost half as fast, or sorry, twice as fast, or in other words, took half as many days to learn this task. And so I was able to make mice learn faster by activating certain types of brain cells. And so that's where my research sort of stands now. I'm trying to understand how this happens and why this happens, though, because I've shown that it can happen. But if we want to try to help people with memory disorders, we have to understand why this is happening, how it's happening, and in which situations does it happen as well. Because the brain can have one brain chemical or one brain area active at a certain time, but a very different one at a very different time. And so we have to think about all those things at once.
And Rick, we do have a question. I think too, people are wondering what flavor of milkshake do they like the most, because other neuroscientists have said that they like strawberry more, which I did not know that.
That's a great question. So this one looks like a strawberry milkshake here, but I actually only use it's like Ensure Vanilla Plus. So I've never tried chocolate or strawberry, though I have thought about it. And since I have a limited number of mice that I work with, I didn't want to try to mess up my results by giving half chocolate, half strawberry, half vanilla. But since most of them liked vanilla well enough, I went ahead and kept on that track. But if someone has tried strawberry and vanilla and said that strawberry is better, then that's very possible. That's a really funny and interesting question.
Cool. So that would be almost like you could do more experiments seeing how different flavors may change that curve.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
Cool. All right. We're getting lots of questions, so I'm just gonna scroll and find. I did have one earlier about kind of like why does the brain need rest, and kind of like what's kind of the purpose of our brain? Why is it useful?
Yeah, that's great. So maybe I'll start big picture with like the purpose of the brain, and then I'll go to the rest part. Um, so really simple animals that don't have brains, for instance, if you think about um, things like jellyfish or really, really small things, they're able to interact with their environment somewhat, right? They are able to respond to stimuli, um, is what a lot of scientists would say. And so by that, that just sort of means if you poke it, it moves away, or it's able to find food, right? But that's not a very complicated behavior. Almost anything, if you poke it, it's going to move away. But as animals evolved and got more and more complicated, they required more complicated processing systems to coordinate behavior. And by coordinating behavior, I just mean walking, even, right? Walking or swimming or flying, things like that. Even though it seems like second nature to us to walk or move around, it actually takes a lot of complicated systems to work together. And so the more and more complicated you get, if you think about smaller animals to us, we're able to do more things. So we don't just walk, we don't just swim. We're also able to solve math problems and give presentations, do science and things like that. So in a grand scheme of things, we have a brain um, because it helps us do more things. And as we evolved, it made us more likely to survive if we could do more complicated things. And for why we need rest. Uh, so the brain is basically some people think about it as a computer, and it does things for us. But that doesn't happen for free, basically, or without a cost. And so we have to eat all the time. We have to be able to fuel the brain. And if you know anything about the way that fuel works, usually it generates waste. So in your car, for instance, there's fumes that come out, there's exhaust, there's some sort of a waste product. And that happens with the brain too. And so there's waste that's generated inside your brain. And so a lot of people think that resting is really required for your brain to sort of go into like a sleep state, or I guess obviously rest and sleep, but to sort of shut down and not do as much for a little bit, and to be able to clear toxins out and to sort of refresh and recharge. And as it relates to memory, sleep is actually really, really important for being able to store memories long term. Because if you don't sleep, you're going to have a lot of memory impairments, or basically have problems with memory.
Yeah, no, I actually recently saw there's different sleep requirements depending on how old you are. So younger people typically need more sleep, but like as we get older, well, it's more of that average 8 hours. So sleep is very important.
Yeah, and thankfully, some school boards are actually taking that science into consideration as they sort of say when you start school as well. Because I remember when I went to high school, I had to wake up super early all the time, and I wasn't very good at that. And I'm still not great at it. Um, but you know, not only the amount of time do you sleep does it change as you're at different ages, but also when you normally will wake up as well.
True, very true. Okay, we've got lots of questions. Our first one. So what part of the brain were you activating again with the lasers?
That's a great question. So I didn't specify because I wanted to keep it simple at first, but for everyone that's interested, I am activating a specific part of the brain called the nucleus basalis. And specifically, I'm targeting cells there that release acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a brain chemical or neurotransmitter, and it's cool because it's able to change the activity of other brain cells. And so it sort of serves as a stop light or a traffic light. So it tells some brain cells to speed up and some to slow down. And I wasn't activating just those brain cells though. I was actually activating brain cells that communicate with another brain area. And so that brain area is called the basolateral amygdala, or BLA. And so that's a brain area that's really important for emotions, both positive and negative emotions, and learning. And so I was activating the cells that release acetylcholine in the BLA, and trying to understand if that affects how well they learn about rewards. So that's a great question. And it can go even deeper into that as well, because that's only one level. But something that's interesting, and why I wanted to look at these acetylcholine cells, the ones that release acetylcholine, is because those are some of the first cells to die in people that have Alzheimer's disease. And so we had a hypothesis that they were involved in, if not learning, then perhaps also memory of these experiences.
Gotcha. So their brain's almost like lighting up really happy when they're getting their milkshake reward. Gotcha.
Right, exactly. So the brain's already going to be doing that, lighting up happily. And so the question is, whenever I'm lighting it up even more to turn on the release of this brain cell, these brain chemicals, somehow it's making the mice learn faster, but it's not clear why to us yet. We did some tests actually to see if it just makes the milkshake more yummy, to maybe make them even more happy, but that didn't seem to be the case. So they won't just work for the laser, and they also will not enjoy the laser by itself whenever I release acetylcholine in their brain. So it doesn't seem like it feels good by itself, but it sort of enhances what's going on with the learning process.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I don't fully understand it yet either, and that's why I'm still studying it.
Yeah. Yeah, so the milkshakes and the lasers are more like the lasers are being pointed at different parts of the mouse brain, and then the mouse is eating the milkshake, and that's how they're all kind of coming together.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason why we have to use a task like this is complicated because I can't just ask the mouse, how strong is your memory? How well do you remember that milkshake? Right? We have to test it. And that's sort of what we do in all animal research and a lot of behavioral research, is that we have to be clever about how we design our experiments so we can try to understand what we're doing when we're changing the brain. And so that lets us sort of get at, because we could sort of think that since the mice like milkshakes and they're trying to learn how to get more milkshakes, if we can make them get more milkshakes faster, it seems like that might be related to learning.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. So then, along with that, are there other animals that you work with, or just mice?
So I currently only work with mice. I have worked with rats in the past, and rats are actually really sweet and nice, and I actually like them a little bit better than mice. But if I tried to use rats in this study, I would actually have to change the way that I do my task because rats are way smarter. And you also can't use the same genetic tools all the time for rats that you can for mice. And so it's sort of a trade-off that you have to make. And so my lab mostly works with mice, and so I stuck with those for now. But it would be really important and interesting for people to try this in other animals to see if it actually holds true for more than just mice, because I don't want to make necessarily really smart mice. I want to apply this to humans, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, and someone also asked, are chimpanzee brains and memory similar to humans? And like, could you use this type of research not just for humans, but look at a lot of other animals and learning?
Right. So that's a great question. And I guess for the first part, chimpanzees are a lot closer to humans, as the person probably knows. But the reason why I'm using mice at all is because even mice learn really similarly to humans, especially about these emotionally important events compared to humans. So they learn about stuff in a lot of the same ways that we do, and they also have similar brain areas that we do as well. And so I work with mice because you can use more of them easier, it's cheaper, it's faster than it is with chimpanzees. And really, people don't really use chimpanzees for research anymore. They usually use rhesus macaques or some other types of monkeys. And so I could use this type of research to translate to helping chimpanzees if that's sort of where the question was going. But it the way that research typically works is you wouldn't do stuff like this in monkeys because you wouldn't have enough animals really to sort of know what you're doing is for sure. And they also they're just not really well suited to this type of research. But that's a really great question, and it's something that scientists have to weigh the options of all the time, because monkeys can do a lot, or primates can do a lot more complicated and cool stuff than mice can, but they don't always work in the exact same way.
Gotcha. Yeah, and about the milkshakes and the mice. So why do you use milkshakes? Is there a reason, or just because they're yummy? And what else do you feed the mice besides just milkshakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I start with milkshakes, as most things happen in labs because someone else did it before in my lab. And so we already had the setup to where I could just deliver the milkshake. And so it's in like a little syringe that goes into a tube and a little cup in their cage in that box that I showed. And so the mice can just sort of lick it up. And so that was really easy because I could very easily control how much I give them. I had thought about giving them little food pellets, like little chocolate pellets, like they're sort of like little Cocoa Puffs, and I was going to um, dip them into the container instead. But I ended up trying the milkshakes, and they liked it better, so I just did that instead. Um, and well, sorry, what was the last part of that question?
What else do you feed the mice, and like why the
Oh, I see. Yeah. So I feed them just a standard chow. So this is something you could get at a pet store, but it is not as tasty at all as the milkshakes. So they get regular mouse food, basically, that veterinarians have developed to make sure that it's healthy and keeps them. It's really nutritious, but it isn't very tasty. It looks just like little pellets, sort of. Um, so they have that, but they much rather have milkshakes if they could. So, similar to you, if I gave you just like little pellets of food that was very nutritious but not tasty, I think you'd want to go for the milkshakes instead.
that makes
And and the reason why the milkshakes is just because they really love them. People in the field have done this before, and it's really common. And so that's one thing you have to consider when you do research is that you want to be able to do something that's sometimes more on the more common side because it helps others replicate your work. You don't always want to stay with what everybody else already does, but sometimes it helps whenever you don't need to complicate it for no reason.
gotcha. Yeah, and so someone asked how many trials are you going to try to do before you're kind of done doing this experiment?
Yeah, so what I showed you is actually just a really small snippet of what I've done. I've actually done this several times. I've done it in both female and male mice, and I've also done it in a couple different ways to see if it mattered whenever I gave the laser when the mice were learning. And then I've also, instead of stimulating or like turning on those brain areas, I also listened to those brain areas to see when does this brain area normally become active during learning. And so I've done a lot of different experiments to try to understand this. And I'm actually in the process of submitting a paper to sort of share this with the rest of the world. And so it's in an initial sort of form of that paper is already up online. So if anyone's interested, they could check it out. But at least for this part of the project, it's one like big group of experiments that I'm ready to share with the other scientists because I have done it so many times that I trust the results, and I was able to convince myself that what I'm seeing isn't just by chance, and also can trust the rest of the people. Or I was able to convince the rest of the people in my lab and my boss as well.
Yeah, yeah, no, because you're going into your fifth year right now, right?
Into my 6th year, I'm just finishing up my 5th.
Gotcha. So do you think that you will be done with your PhD at the end of this year? Some people are wondering when they can read your final results.
Uh, so I am hoping to be done with my PhD by the end of this year, but as everyone knows, COVID has sort of thrown a wrench in a lot of stuff. But I actually submitted my paper and I've got some revisions back, and so those were mostly positive. And so I just have to change some stuff, do some new analysis, and also answer some questions that were not clear, and then hopefully the paper will come through. So I can share a link with y'all to send out afterwards if they want to see it in a really basic form, to where it's not been fully edited, and so they can see that. And so it's a lot more complicated than that, but I'd be happy to answer questions if anyone has any follow-up questions about that. But yeah, so hopefully I'll be done at the end of this year. So maybe a year from now, I'll have a PhD. But that doesn't mean that this project is over with because there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, that's always the cool thing about science is even with your project is going to answer these questions, but there's always kind of more to learn about. Someone even asked, like, can their age affect learning? Because you mentioned using male and female mice, but maybe the age of the mouse. Do you know if that changes how they learn, maybe?
Absolutely. So to go off of the male and female stuff, I think it's been underappreciated for a long time that males and females learn differently. And so the NIH, so the government institution that funds a lot of scientific research, has mandated that you have to study both males and females because for a long time people just studied male animals, and that's not great because we know that men and women learn about things in different ways, a logical perspective as well for animals. And so if something is what people might think is unrelated as sex, which is really not, if something like that can affect how you learn, then age certainly can affect how well you learn. And so I have to use mice that are within a certain age range, because otherwise they just, not only do they kind of forget and not learn as well, but they also can't hear that sound that comes on, the sort of beep that tells them to nose poke. They can't hear it as well because they start to go deaf. So that's one of the downsides. So I have to use mice that are around 5 months old, basically, is what I shoot for, which is an adult mouse.
Yeah. And the control part. So someone asked, what are the controls of your experiment? That's the mice that are not getting the laser, right?
Yeah, so the control is, so I simplify it to say that they're not getting laser, but what I actually do is I just put the laser in without the optogenetic tool. So all the mice have the fibers that deliver laser, but like I mentioned when we first started, if I put a laser in your head, it wouldn't do anything, right? It would maybe just make your brain light up. Um, so the control mice get lasers, but the lasers don't do anything. And the reason why we do that is because we want to have it as close to the laser mice as possible, but without turning on those brain cells. And so the control mice are just normal mice, basically learning how they normally would without turning on certain brain areas. And that's a great question, because if I want to make any strong statements about this, the way that I'm turning on certain brain cells and how it affects learning, I'd have to have a good control so that we can convince ourselves that we're not just doing something by chance, or actually maybe messing something else up that isn't related to what we're doing.
Yeah. And I got a question earlier. So when did you figure out that you wanted to work in a lab and be a scientist? I know you mentioned it a little bit, but if you could kind of elaborate.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. And the short answer is I still don't know if I want to be a scientist that works in the lab. And that's because even though I've come to school to do a PhD, that's only a small sliver of my life. And scientists aren't sentenced for the rest of their lives to stay in a laboratory. Scientists do lots of things. Scientists become politicians, they become teachers, they become um, tons of other things. They don't have to just work in a lab playing with mice, right? So my parents didn't go to school. My parents didn't go to college, so I'm the first one in my family to go to college. And so I didn't really know that research or working in a lab was an option. I mean, sure, I saw it on TV and stuff like that, but I didn't know what it really meant to get there. So whenever I was many of your viewers' ages, I didn't know that was really an option for me. But once I got to college, I found out all about research, and I found out that I could volunteer in a lab, and I was super interested in that. And I thought that seemed really neat. And so I started emailing all kinds of professors, and I never heard back from a lot of them. And then I got lucky, and I got into a lab that was actually a company. And so this scientific company, basically, they are able to analyze brain cells and see how complex they are and also how big they are. And they can compare control and treated groups, similar to what we just talked about with control and lasers in my group, in my experiments. And they look to see if they can help other scientists see if their treatments can help people with brain disorders, basically. And so that was my first experience in the lab. And I liked it in a lot of ways, but I wanted to do things that were more hands-on and wet lab. So I started working in a bioengineering company. And so I got a chance to try to grow brain cells outside of the body. And so that's what really got me hooked and wanted me to go back into, or to go to science for a PhD. And so that's how I first started out. But remember that I'm not sure exactly if that's what I want to do for the rest of my life, because I'm really passionate about science outreach. So stuff like Skype a Scientist, I do activities like that. So I'm wearing my Flip Science Fair shirt because this is something that I do at Yale, to where we get grad students to explain their research to middle schoolers. Um, and so I really love doing stuff like this because, as I mentioned, I didn't know that I wanted to be a scientist when I was growing up, and I didn't know that that was a possibility for me. So I am really passionate about making sure that other students know that, and that they can do that as well.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's really important that if you like science, you don't have to be like the in the lab scientist. There's lots of other different careers and different cool things that you can do if you like science.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I know that I love working at the bench, which means like doing experiments. I loved doing that. And I knew that I wanted to dedicate at least a part of my life to that because I knew how much I cared about science education and outreach. And I knew that maybe if I didn't do it now, I wouldn't get a chance to do it later, right? So I wanted to have that opportunity for my life to do that, at least for a small portion of it.
Awesome. I have a question about do you see any negative effects of the laser?
So this is a great question, and maybe that person has already read a paper from my collaborator, because the complicated part about this story about acetylcholine and the brain area that I was turning on that releases that one brain chemical is that if you turn that on whenever the mice are learning about a negative experience or something scary, it actually makes those memories stronger and harder to forget. So it's really complicated how the same brain area, the same brain chemical, but in different situations can affect different types of memories also in a slightly different way because I made mice learn faster, but for negative experiences it made mice have a stronger memory because those are sort of the two sides of the coin for learning, right? Because you could learn something really, really well or really fast, for instance, like if you cram for a test, but your memory is not very strong, right? And it goes away. But you also could learn something that like sort of a long time over that took a while and it stays around for a long time. And so the same brain area, same brain chemical, but in different situations affects memories differently. And so that's one of the things that I think is important for us to keep in mind. And so that was a really smart and insightful question.
Yeah, and someone also asked, or two people asked, how does what you learn in mice get translated to helping people? Like, are you developing drugs to help activate the same parts of the brain? Yeah.
So this is a question that I think we should always ask ourselves whenever we're doing something, because I'm one of the main reasons why I do this research is because I'm personally just interested in how the brain works. That's my main motivation. Like, I think this is a really cool problem and I want to see how it works. And neuroscience gives me a chance to sort of turn these knobs and change how a living animal is able to learn about the world. And I think that's really fascinating about how you can do that. But it also is really important to helping people like, for instance, humans, because as I mentioned before, mice have a lot of the same brain areas that humans do, and they also have the same brain chemicals, and they learn about stuff in similar ways to us as well. So while mice are still very different from humans in a lot of important ways, if we are able to know the brain chemicals that are important during learning and memory, then we can try to help develop drugs, or at least, since I don't develop drugs myself, we can give people who do that for a living the information they need in order to make better therapies and drugs. So for instance, we can tell them, hey, the drug has to affect this brain chemical receptor system. It has to work on this brain area. It should probably be given at this time. So timing is really important too, especially for learning and memory. So for instance, say, hey, you have to give this this is hypothetical, but it has to be given within a 36-hour window, for instance, after trauma or something like that. So if someone doesn't develop PTSD, that's completely an example and just a guess, but that's how this type of research can be applied to people to make their lives better. And it doesn't just happen with drugs too. So it could be therapies as well, talking with a behavioral therapist or something to try to help people develop better habits, or how do we learn about things.
Gotcha. And some questions about sleep. So do you know how much sleep younger people might need, and how can maybe oversleeping impact your brain? Because we talked about not sleeping enough, but what about if you get too much?
So those are great questions and ones that I don't have a lot of answers to. So as you may have found from talking to other scientists, they're usually really specific. Most scientists only know a lot about one small area. But what I do know about sleep and how it relates to younger people is that basically younger people are very different. There's not just younger than 20, right? There's a lot of age ranges within there that are developing in different ways. So I do know, for instance, teenagers, especially around the 16 to 18 area, they need a good bit more sleep than the 8 hours. I think it's even closer to 10 hours sometimes is what they should be getting. But if you type in ages and sleep time in Google, you'll find some really interesting answers, like a table that says like 0 to 2 years old or something like that. So you'll be able to find some really good answers about that. And as far as oversleeping, I'm not really sure how that might affect the brain, but we could sort of hypothesize about that and think maybe oversleeping keeps you from experiencing the world and learning things. So maybe it's not directly oversleeping that affects your brain, but maybe the lack of input or the lack of experiences that could affect it.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry, we're getting lots of cool questions. We do have some people asking about where they can maybe find the paper, which I think you mentioned that you'll be able to share that with us, and then we can share that with them.
Absolutely. And I also, so I'll share the paper, and I also, because I really care about outreach and communication, I made an animated GIF about my paper that summarizes the two main points as well. So I'll share that as well.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to that. We'll definitely share that with all of you. So that'll be really cool. And then you can show your friends and tell them about how you learned about lasers and milkshakes.
That's
Um,
right.
and so we do have some questions about, let me find, oh, what animal do you wish that you could work with? Like, what would be a cool animal?
Hmm. Well, I guess so. I'm really picky when it comes to science, and I think my wife would say that I'm picky with everything, but I choose to say I'm particular. But I'm really interested in specifically learning and memory and how animals learn about things faster than others, or why is it that, like, how do we have memories? And so mice and rats are actually a really great tool for that, and they're a great system because they're not way too smart, so I don't have to design a task that's super complicated, like like a crossword puzzle or something. Um, but I also am able to do really complex things. So mice can actually learn quite a bit, and they're actually pretty bright, more than you might think actually. But if we're talking about working with animals for fun, I love cats, so I have two cats. So I'd be happy to work with cats if I got a chance to play with them, for instance, and train them to do mazes. But it's important to remember that when working with animals, it's a huge responsibility, and we take this really seriously. So even though I try to make sure that the mice are cared for and that they aren't suffering pain when they don't need to, it's a really big privilege to work with these animals. And so unfortunately, it's not all milkshakes and fun for mice and for lab animals. And so it's important to remember that, if I was to work with, for instance, really complicated animals like primates or dolphins or something like that, um, sometimes you're going to be doing things that aren't pleasant. So you may not want to always do that.
A question a little bit off track, not about research. What do you like to do for fun? Like as a scientist, what do you do in your spare time?
That's a great question. So I do have spare time, and I mentioned the outreach. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, and specifically, so I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and I am really trying to make sure that um, people in New Haven feel like scientists that live in their neighborhoods are really their neighbors and their friends. And so I spend a lot of time working with community members to partner with them and sort of see how we can break down barriers between Yale and New Haven, because Yale has, for a lot of reasons, some bad reputations as far as not working together really well with the community. And so I'm really passionate about trying to make sure that's not the case. And so I try to be involved in my neighborhood, like for instance with community cleanups or fall festivals. I'll bring hands-on activities to those, and I'm also active in a lot of stuff that's going on politically, and so that's a lot of stuff that I do in my free time. But things that are more fun that you would imagine that people explain in free time, I really love to garden. So I love to grow vegetables and fruits. So I have a really cool. My wife and I have a shared community garden plot close to our house, and so I'm going to be going there to water our plants after this. So I love to garden. I love to play video games, board games, card games, be outside. So I was just camping this weekend, and I also brought board games there to play with my friends. And I also have two cats, as I mentioned, so I like to take them outside and take them on walks. And that's not always super successful because they don't always want to walk. But those are just a couple of things I really love to do in my free time.
That's really cool. Yeah, cats don't like to go on walks sometimes, but not like dogs.
Exactly. They
Um,
like going outside, but they want to lay down when they get outside or eat grass. One of my cats loves eating grass.
That's funny. We do have a question about what was you mentioned your high school science experience. They just want to know a little bit more about kind of how that was for you.
Yeah. So so as I mentioned, my high school wasn't super advanced. It's not in a well-performing, like a high-performing district. Um, but I did take advanced placement classes or AP classes. So I took a couple of classes like AP biology. I took regular chemistry, but it wasn't. For instance, I didn't like get an internship at university. I didn't know any scientists. I didn't get a chance to do any, exceptional things like that. But I was mostly just learning stuff out of textbooks and memorizing facts, like a lot of people might have to do. And so that's one of the reasons why I wasn't super excited about, or I just didn't think that science was necessarily for me, because um, I was pretty rebellious back then, and I guess in some ways I still am. And I don't like just memorizing something to memorize something. I like to know why. I don't want to. If you just tell me this is how it is, I don't find that interesting. I find that really boring. And so my high school experience is definitely not what pushed me to become a scientist, but it did lay the foundation for me to understand more complicated science when I got to college.
Sure. Cool. And some questions about the mice. So we have a few. I'm going to kind of combine them. We have a question on how old are they when they start training, and how long do they live, and kind of what's kind of the when they're born, and then when do they start training, and then when do they stop training?
Yeah, so that's great questions. So when mice are born, they're usually, or so they are like little jelly beans, sort of, and they can't really do anything. And so they're actually born premature compared to what humans would be born. Um, but it when mice start training actually depends on what you're studying. So if you're a developmental biologist or a developmental neuroscientist, maybe you would study mice whenever they're really, really young, to understand how a developing brain learns. But since I'm mostly focusing on adults, I work with mice starting at around 4 months old, and I try not to work with mice after they're about 8 months old, because that's an age range to where I think that they'll be behaving in similar ways. Because you can imagine if I had some young whippersnapper mice that were really eager to learn, for instance, then it might be different than if I compared them to adults. So it's important to have all your groups be similar ages. And so that's the age range I look at, but scientists look at all kinds of age ranges depending on their question. But mice can naturally live for about a couple of years. Usually around 2 years is about how old they can live.
Gotcha. Cool. And a question about the experiment is someone's asking, like, what does it mean when the mouse doesn't get the milkshake? And they kind of want to know, like, why do some get the milkshake and why maybe some don't?
So that's a really interesting question, because it's funny because I actually had to average mice over like several days. So I have to group them, because just one mouse doing something is usually not it is not enough to tell you what's really going on. And if you ever go into behavioral neuroscience, or for instance, you study population things, right? You know that one human is not enough to understand a trend of what's going on, because humans have individual differences. And the same is true for mice. And so mice are going to learn at different rates, but we average them to try to find what's going to happen typically. So that being said, if a mouse isn't doing very well, maybe the mouse is not feeling well, maybe it's not very hungry, maybe it doesn't like milkshakes. So there's a lot of things that could be going on as to why the mouse isn't doing well. But on average, I find that mice will typically learn pretty well after about 9 days. But if you look at individual behavior for these mice, maybe they aren't learning because they're not paying attention. Because I actually, instead of just measuring how many milkshakes they get, I also measure how many times they do it incorrectly. So how many times do they put their nose in the hole when they're not supposed to? And some do that a lot and then get discouraged, and then they stop, and then they eventually figure it out. So the short answer is that a lot of mice are going to be doing different stuff. And so it's not clear why one is doing it wrong and the other isn't.
Gotcha. It's probably similar to, like, all humans kind of learn differently. Like, not all of us learn the same way, and sometimes things are harder than others. So it just kind of is all kind of different for everyone.
Exactly. And that's really important for us to keep in mind when we study anything, because even though mice might seem like it sometimes, they're not little robots. They all have their own different personality, sort of like personalities that they're doing different stuff. But they are interestingly pretty superstitious. So if a mouse, like for instance, always turns its head to the right and then nose pokes, they'll oftentimes always do that. And so there's a lot of cool research to show how superstitious animals can be. And I think humans too. If you know about baseball players wearing the same socks all the time, it can be like that too.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, that's really funny actually. We do have a question about how are brain cells actually formed? Just kind of like a basic how do they form, and then something about like what kind of waste is created by the brain. So just some questions about like how does the brain work?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. And a lot of people are studying how our brain cells form because we still don't know a lot about it. We know that brain cells, much like every other cell in the body, form from stem cells originally. And so basically, your brain gives a lot of different signals to those stem cells to sort of become basically differentiate or become either a muscle cell, a bone cell, or a brain cell. So those work in like really similar ways. But exactly how the brain cell becomes a certain type of brain cell or a support brain cell and how it gets to where it's supposed to live is actually really, really complicated. And it's not just like, let's say that we grew brain cells outside of the body, we still aren't going to be able to recreate the brain because it has to, certain brain cells have to talk to other brain cells in order to work well. And so that's like, it's a really big can of worms as far as understanding how brain cells are formed. But basically, the short answer is the body's just really good at doing that sort of stuff. And it tells it somehow through all the messages in our DNA. And it sort of is able to guide stem cells to become brain cells. And the type of waste that brain cells make, which is similar to other waste in the body, is basically just like uh, uh, metabolic waste, basically. So your brain cells are using energy in the form of ATP and other things, and so there are byproducts, basically, and so those have to be taken out. And so I'm not a cell metabolist, so I don't know exactly like the molecules that there are, but it's basically just sort of like junk that the body is already, or the brain cells have already used, that need to be shuttled out of the body, out of that area, and replenished with stuff. So similar to like me gardening, I have to give the plants some sort of food and they eventually make it into stuff, but they also generate waste. And so I would need to take out the old soil, put in new soil, give them water, stuff like that.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think I've gone through all the questions. We've had tons of questions today, which was awesome. Thank you all for asking so many cool questions. We do have three that we always ask everyone. So the first question, is there anything that you wish that you were asked about?
Hmm. I think maybe so. Something I do much of my deep thinking while doing the dishes. So I like, that's my favorite chore to do. And so I think about a lot of stuff that is very important to me. And I was thinking about what might you ask, or what might someone ask, or what would I want to be told if I was interested in becoming a scientist? And the question was, what's the most important quality for a scientist, or what did you really wish that someone had told you to encourage you? And I actually really couldn't come up with a good answer for that, because so I couldn't come up with a good answer because there are so many different things that go into becoming a good scientist. But I think the two most important are probably passion, so really caring about what it is you're doing and caring about it for the right reasons. Does it motivate you? Does it make you want to wake up in the morning to go to lab? And so even though I said I don't wake up really well early, I get up and go to lab every day at 7 a.m. when I'm running behavior, because that's when mice do best. Um, or at least in my task, that's when they do best. And so passion to be able to do that is really important, but also resilience or tenacity, or just being stubborn in some ways, because I spent about a year and a half of my PhD with nothing working, not a single thing working for me. All my experiments messed up. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I was bad at the mouse brain surgeries. Nothing was working for me. And so I had to sort of rely on my passion and the fact that I cared about this a lot, but also that I cared enough to not just give up after a year and a half. And so those are the two things that I think, if anyone's interested in being a scientist, if if those are things that you think you can do, then I think that the door's actually definitely open to you. But you don't have to have that right now, right? Like maybe if I was in high school now, I would have given up after a couple months. So these are skills that you build up and that you learn more about, and as you find more about yourself, you find that you can better do them.
Very cool. Thank you. And the second question is there something that you wish that everyone knew about your work? Like if you could just tell every person in the world, like, this is what I do, like, what would you want to tell? What would you want to tell them?
I mean, I would probably start with the tagline to get people interested that, I use milkshakes, lasers, and mice to study learning and memory. But I guess, the big takeaway I would want someone to have is that even by studying something as seemingly simple as mice and how their brains work, this gives us a serious glimpse into the way that our brains work and the way that we're forming memories and the way that we're learning. And it's so fundamental to what it means to be human, because if you think about everything in your life, it wouldn't really matter if you couldn't remember it, right? And so understanding what brain chemicals are going on whenever mice are learning really teaches us a lot about what it means for human brains to work as well. So I think just helping someone connect those dots, that it's not just me playing with mice and giving them milkshakes, but that it's actually, I'm trying to help understand what's going on in human brains too.
Gotcha. Really cool. And the last question that we have for you is there something that you wish everyone knew about anything, like any fun science fact or any fun fact that you just really think is cool that you want to share?
Any fun fact? So I guess, as I mentioned earlier, like I'm not super big for memorizing facts and stuff. But I guess I'm more interested in like the curiosity, right? Like what is it that drives someone to, or what is it that, how do we know these things, or why do we think these things are true? So I don't know that I have a really good answer for like one science fact being put on the spot, but I guess one thing that I wish everyone knew, or that I wish everyone thought about at least, was empathy. So I don't study emotions, or I don't study that, but I just, especially currently in the world, I wish people were a little more kind to each other, a little more understanding, and take that second to realize that people have really tough lives in a lot of ways, and that we should be trying to figure out how to make everyone's life better. So that's what instead of a fun fact, maybe just something to consider and something to think about and take an extra second to do in your life.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, the third question is always really open-ended. Just like anything that you thought was cool that you wanted to share. And we have some positive comments from the attendees saying it was really well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's our conclusion. Do you have any last thoughts, or I think we kind of covered almost everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm really excited to be doing this. And the reason why I do stuff like this is because I want to let people know that anyone can be a scientist, and everyone should think that science is an option for them. You don't have to be in the lab to be a scientist. You don't have to, and you don't have to like be a scientist to appreciate science either, right? It's science is for everyone, and the benefits of science help everyone as well. So just, even if it seems like science might not be for you, that's not the case. It doesn't matter what you look like, where you come from, your background, who you love, anything like that. It just matters if you want to answer cool questions and get to solve solve a lot of problems in the world.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. All you really need is curiosity and passion, and you can pursue whatever you're interested in.
Exactly.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. This was great. Lots of people are saying how great this was. I'm really glad I got to find out what the milkshakes and the lasers and how all of that worked together. And if you could send us the gift that you've created, I would love to share that with everyone that visits our website, and share that with the people that attended today. And then definitely for all of the attendees, check out our website and look at the July calendar, and you can see what else we have going on this week. For any adults on the call, we have trivia every Thursday. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Rick, so much.
Thank you. Take
Great.
care, everyone.
Bye.